All right, then, I just wanted to get started and say thank you to all the attendees who have joined us today. I'd like to turn it over to our host and webinar moderator, Mr. Sina Adibi from Adaptive Clinical Systems.
Thank you, Malcolm. Welcome to the third in series on frictionless data webinars hosted by Adaptive Clinical. In case you missed our first two, they're available at no charge on our website. I urge you to go and download those. The first one was on the importance of ensuring fluid interchange of data amongst and across all of the different components in a clinical trial. And that naturally, that discussion evolved to the significant role that patients are increasingly playing in clinical trials. And indeed, patients are the sources of data now, and they should be considered and accounted for as such. Today, we're going to continue that conversation on how to leverage the power of data and digitization to, let's call it, rewire clinical trials going forward. As Malcolm said, I'm Sina Adibi. I'm CEO and founder of Adaptive Clinical. In my career, I've had the privilege of watching many transformations that clinical trials have undergone. Not as extensive an experience and tenure as my panelists here, whom you'll hear from soon. But I had the privilege of witnessing EDCs coming of age with FDA support. We all embraced that, and then we all went to ePros, risk-based monitoring, real-world evidence data, analytics, and then beyond that now we're all laser-focused on virtual trials. Our Adaptive Clinical was lucky enough to have a front row seat in a lot of these transformations with our Adaptive eClinical bus. We helped a lot of our clients and partners undergo that transformation in managing data. Next slide, please, Malcolm. With me today are two thought leaders from Optum. Peter Payne, who is head of Digital Research Network, and Cynthia Sinertia, Vice President, Data Management and Analytics from Digital Research. Welcome.
Thank you.
Peter, take a moment and tell us about your career journey to Optum.
As you'll see from the grey hair, it's been quite long. But I started out my career, actually I was born and raised in the UK. And I started out my career as a bench pharmacologist studying cardiovascular pharmacology. And after a few years of that, it dawned on me that I was not going to be winning a Nobel Prize anytime soon. So I went into the clinical area and actually got to work for a company called Sterling Drug, which probably now is part of the Sanofi organization. And I was a clinical research associate there, and also helped them with some due diligence on some assets that we were licensing in the cardiovascular area. I then ended up working as a project manager at that was then Glaxo in respiratory medicine, and that was in the good old days when our case report forms were 4-part NCR paper. And I used to travel around Europe picking up copies of case report forms and taking them back to the data center, and somebody would double data enter all that data from the paper. It's quite remarkable. And then, of course, when the NDA was ready to go in, it would get loaded into the back of an 18-wheeler truck. So, times have changed. After that, I actually spent quite a lot of time in the contract research business as an operations manager and also in business development. I spent a little time, about 4 years, working in a corporate ventures fund. And then I did some time in a non-profit as well. Immediately prior to coming to Optum, I was actually an independent consultant, helping in-licensing companies are wanting to in-license products either from other companies or from academic groups. And I joined Optum in January 2019 and took on my current role as head of the Digital Research Network in March of this year.
Okay. Great. Thank you very much, Peter. Cynthia, would you like to share your journey with us?
Sure. So my first foray into clinical trials was back in 1984 when I was the clinical research coordinator for the TIMI-1 trial at Beth Israel Hospital in Boston. Eventually, a few of us took off and we created an academic research organization called CDAC, which became the Harvard Clinical Research Institute. I moved from there over to Phase Forward, which at that time was a first in market kind of EDC system that created the Inform product.
Wow.
Inform was, then it was acquired by Oracle. And I stayed with Oracle for about 2 years. And then the founder of Phase Forward, who was Paul Bleicher at that point in time, called me up and he said, you got to get out of there and come on over to Humedica. So I left Oracle and went to Humedica. And that was around 2012. And then we were acquired by Optum. So I've been managing two different types of acquisitions. I was acquired once by Oracle and once by Optum, and I've been with Optum since 2013 and moved into the Digital Research Network around 2017 and have worked with trying to build out the ability to actually bring my life dream to fruition, meaning that we can move data from an electronic health record into an EDC system without anybody having to retype anything. So I hope to have that happen in my lifetime.
Oh, it will. It will. We'll put those truckers out of business that Peter was.
Absolutely. Absolutely.
I do feel bad for them. Well, thank you very much. Very impressive. Thank you for agreeing to participate. And now the audience, just a couple of things. There is a way we would like to encourage you. This is going to be interactive. There is a Q&A session at the very end, so we encourage the audience to go to the little tab that says questions. It would be in the little palette from GoToWebinar, and type in your questions. And at the very end, we will go through and respond to those. And if we run out of time, we will follow up with you individually. But now you heard about who we are, and we want to know who you are. So if you could put the polling question up, Malcolm.
Sure, it's up now. I'm going to share the results to that question, and attendees should be able to see that we've got our top two answers: clinical technology provider and patient recruitment site management earned 45% and 24% of our attendees today.
Excellent, excellent. Very appropriate. Well, that's we will have very relevant topics for you. If you could put that slide back up. So rather than the format of this was, we decided rather than make you read the screen on hundreds of pages of PowerPoint, really these are the four broad topics that we would like to cover here with you. And the first one is how is Optum Digital Research Network poised to help in this revolution? Peter, can you help us with that? Give us your views.
Sure, thanks, Sina. I certainly will. And just for those in the audience who do not know much about Optum, maybe I can just explain a little bit about who we are. So Optum is a health services innovation company. We're actually part of United Health Group, and our corporate mission is helping people live healthier lives and helping the health system work better for everyone. I think I'd say that our core capabilities are around consumer experience, clinical expertise, embedded technology, data, and analytics. Optum itself is composed of three main businesses, and some of which you may be familiar with. Optum Rx, which is a pharmacy services business, Optum Health, which is a healthcare services business, and Optum Insight, which is predominantly technology and consulting. And within Optum Insight is a life sciences group, and that's where the Digital Research Network sits. So that's kind of orients you to where the Digital Research Network is within Optum. I'm now going to describe what we're trying to do or what we are doing in the Digital Research Network. Our mission is to reinvent some components of clinical research operations by combining data, our network, some technology that we've developed, and our expertise in an attempt to reduce the cost of developing new therapies and also to improve the patient and provider experience. The current challenges in clinical trial operations that we're really sort of laser focused on right now are around patient enrollment, because you know that everybody has problems in patient enrollment. We saw I think it was a Frost and Sullivan report of 2018, which stated that 80% of biopharma clinical trials do not meet their enrollment timelines. And that has an average cost of lost commercial opportunity for a given drug of about $1.3 million per day. One of the other statistics we see commonly is that even despite a lot of feasibility work being done by sponsors, CROs, once a site is contracted, about 37% of them fail to enroll a single patient. 37% don't meet their enrollment targets, and about 10% actually fail to enroll a single patient. So there's a huge amount of inefficiency in the current patient enrollment system. The other way that we're trying to make change in current operations is with data capture and data management, and I'll talk a little bit more about some of the detail behind that as we go on. So we talk about data that we're using. Maybe I should describe what some of our data assets are. We have an electronic health record data asset, which covers around about 100 million patient lives across the United States. Wow. We also have a deterministically linked data set, which is claims and EHR, which covers about 60 million individual patient journeys. And then from a clinical research perspective, one of the really interesting assets is a person-linked EHR and claims data set that covers about 23 million patients across the US. And I think later on in this discussion, we'll talk about where EHR is best and where claims is best, and where the mix is really gives you some really good results. The technology that we've been developing, there are two key components of this. There's a piece of software that we use for patient finding. This is you can basically code in all your protocol eligibility criteria, and then that tool will develop an algorithm that we can use to go and search across the entire EHR data set to look for patients who match those eligibility criteria. We can then see where those patients being treated, who their healthcare providers are, and we can kind of start to cut and dice the data by healthcare organization, and we can start to see where patients within healthcare organizations that are contracted with us for the purposes of clinical research are. And I think that the kind of unique thing to Optum is that under our business associate agreements with sites that are contracted to us, we actually have permission to re-identify patients back to those healthcare providers in the case that they are eligible for clinical studies. And all that is under what's called in HIPAA preparatory for research. And so if you're working on a particular project, once we've got the site selected and they're qualified and initiated, we can actually go in, run that algorithm that we've developed, and issue patient listings to those sites at a cadence that is appropriate for the study. Clearly you don't want to be sending listings of 300 patients every month, because that may overwhelm the site. But we work closely with the sites to determine what those listings should look like and what they're most interested in receiving. One of the things that we think this is, we talk about this internally as being kind of, in inverted commas, digital chart review. But we do feel that it does actually help the sites, particularly for enrolling patients where there are very complex eligibility criteria. We're currently working on a cardiovascular study where I think that the number of eligibility criteria is somewhere between 35 and 40. It took a lot of work to actually develop the algorithm that can search for these patients. And we know full well that the site would probably spend 3 or 4 hours going through all of those eligibility criteria for each patient. And we feel what we're doing is basically identifying patients who have a very high probability of getting through screening within that study. The other piece of technology we've developed is a piece of middleware that allows us to pull data direct from an EMR system into an EDC system, and it will also pull over the audit trail that goes with that EHR data. This actually allows us to avoid transcription of data from EHR into EDC. We're currently using this in a study at the moment. It's an observational study that we've set up to demonstrate that this is possible with multiple EMR systems. We will be bringing that study to at least the end of enrollment at the end of this month, and we'll be closing it out early next year. And I would say that so far it's gone very well. We've learned a lot about mapping EHR data into EDC systems. The EDC in this case is actually read-only for the sites. The other data that's being brought in is ePro data. But within this kind of environment, you can also have a hybrid study where you're pulling the majority of data from EHR, but there might be data that you want from other sources to bring into the EDC, in which case you'd create an ECRF and effectively have a hybrid design study where you've got direct from EHR data and entered data in the same EDC. Both of these capabilities, really do ease burden of participation on the sites. We've had some really, really positive feedback from the sites taking part in this study. One was actually told us that we had renewed her faith in clinical research because she was able to take part in clinical research whilst focusing on the care of her patients rather than dealing with data queries. And so that's been really encouraging. And we're just kind of trying to move this ahead and do more and more of this kind of work.
Wow, thank you very much. Very impressive. I'm sure the audience have a lot of questions about that that we will get to. For the next item, I want to turn to you, Cynthia. All my career, patient recruitment was the Achilles heel of clinical trials. As Peter pointed out, missing recruitment targets has been a big problem. But it felt like, every year, Cynthia would come up with the magic bullet. It was like texting and social. And we thought, oh, that's great. We're gonna do that. Why is it so hard? Why is it still so hard, Cynthia? And we're gonna blame you for it. You're on mute, I believe.
Sorry, I said, what have I been up to these last 30 years that I haven't fixed this yet?
Go ahead. Thank you.
I think that protocols, as Peter said, have been becoming more and more complex. I mean, we see it all the time when we have 40 exclusion criteria and 15 inclusion criteria. And I always say that, if I was still a nurse in a clinical setting, I would just say, I don't want to do this protocol because it's way too complicated. And even though we have EHR systems available to us now, where in my old days we used to have to look through charts of paper, finding those eligibility criteria in the EHR systems is still complicated, because the requirements are so specific. Often they're looking for things that happened way, way back in history. And as you know, patients are not really good historians about when their heart attack happened or how long ago they had their colonoscopy or whatever. So we really have found that by searching in the EHR data ourselves, pulling up, histories from our patients in the EHRs that can go back as far back as 2007, we are able to help our sites find patients for trials that is much more comprehensive than they would have time to do in their daily activities of trying to find patients by looking through charts or even looking through EMR systems, because EMR systems were not developed for clinical research, they were developed for clinical care. So as Peter said, a third of the sites failed to meet their enrollment targets, and half of the investigators are one and done. Basically, they do one research trial and they say, okay, that was way too complicated. That was enough for me. We don't want to do that. So truly, by using the EMR as our source and by having all of these accesses to these systems, and what our data is not only electronic, but it is also normalized. So all of our provider organizations' data looks the same. We have the same units of measure for the lab tests. We have normalized all of the units of measure for how you code drugs. We can look at NDC codes for medications to determine the dosages and the methods of medications in the system. So it really helps us by enabling us to run a chart review against the EHR data. And if there are unique things that aren't in what we call structured data would be things like diagnoses and medications and lab tests and procedures, we have the ability to actually go into those clinical notes and look for things such as symptomatology being more severe, or heartburn being the primary cause of the person's concern. Those kinds of things are available to us when we're trying to help our sites and our sponsors find the right patients for the trials. We can also help in the study design and doing the feasibility, because if a customer comes to us with a very complicated protocol and we actually run the algorithm, which one we've done for a lupus study that has required us to create 280 different data tables to merge together to find the EULAR criteria and the SLEDI criteria that are all very complicated algorithms to run. We can do that for our sites and help them find those patients by giving them a list that would say, these are the patients that we believe meet the criteria. And there may be additional things they want to add on to that criteria. They may say, well, I know from personal experience that patients who are taking 2 or 3 antipsychotic or psychotropic medications are not the best candidate for these trials. I want you to exclude those patients from my list. We can add that on as a physician requested requirement for that particular list that we give to those patients. And then on an annual or on monthly basis, as we update the list to those sites, we can look at what has worked, what hasn't worked. We can tweak the code, perhaps add another additional criteria about a particular medication or a particular disease that they want to add on specifically to help them find the right patients.
Perfect. Wow. So many questions come to mind. These were all, you touched on all sorts of vulnerabilities that we have during conceiving of the trial through to inclusion exclusion criteria. So if let's say I'm talking to a biotech and they have this interesting thing and they have gotten investors to fund their study, at what stage should they be consulting this data? Is it upfront during protocol design? Is it after the design for tweaking? Is it during the operation? Can you talk through that a little bit?
Want me to take that, Peter, or would you like to take it?
Sure. Well, I'll join in as well, but we'll say the same answer.
The earlier the better is what we always say, but it hasn't happened that way yet. It's they usually come to us with a protocol that they've already gone through all of their internal processes to get approved. And then when we look at the data, we say to them, well, out of our 100 million patients, we can find you about 20. Then they go, oh my God, what happened? Where are they? What did you do? And then, we can let them see, precisely where we're losing patients. And some of it may be that the tests that they're using to qualify a patient are not commonly done in real world. Perhaps the questionnaires that they expect the patients to fill out and meet would not be done, and we have no way of really doing a surrogate for that type of information. A lot of studies ask for creatinine clearance results. Well, not many people have creatinine clearance results unless they happen to have kidney disease. Mm-hmm. So often that's a missing piece of information that may be important for qualifying a patient, but it's not determined in a normal patient care system. I don't know, Peter, do you have anything you want to add on to that?
Yeah, I'd just add to that oftentimes, we're quite new to this, but oftentimes sponsors will come to us. We worked with one last year who wanted to set up a registry of patients in a particularly rare form of autoimmune hemolytic anemia. And we went through about a dozen different iterations of defining a population for them. And then you look at autoimmune hemolytic anemia and the diagnosis code for that. If you run that through our EHR data set, you find about 1.3 million patients. And you go, okay, that's good substrate to be starting with. But by the time we had whittled through all the hematologic criteria, liver function criteria, kidney function criteria they had, I think we ended up somewhere, the most under one scenario was about 130, and the other that they really wanted was 67. So you think you went from 1.3 million down to 67, and they are scattered all over the country. If you want to set up a registry to follow these patients, that's going to be a very expensive exercise for maybe, you may capture half of those patients in the registry. So at least through doing that, we were able to save them the expenditure of setting up that registry and then finding they couldn't get anybody into it. But I think it would have been a more worthwhile exercise if we'd had a more open collaboration from the get-go and saying, what do you really want to achieve out of this in terms of getting knowledge about this patient population, rather than having these very, very rigid, this is the perfect patient we want to find.
Right. So the flexibility. Go ahead.
We've actually been going through a protocol with another customer of ours who, when we go through them line by line, they tell us when we're looking at how we're going to code that criteria, oh, just ignore that one. And we're like, what? And they're like, well, they'll figure it out at the time they see the patient. And we're like, okay, what about the sites? How will they know that they're supposed to ignore that one then? So it's been a very interesting experience of going through the eligibility that they're putting out to their sites to try and find patients for, when actually they may not really be that important. And it's been an interesting experience to figure this out.
Another point I'd make, Sina, is that we're getting more and more inquiries now. And in fact, if you there's hardly a week goes by now where there isn't a webinar which is aimed at, the great problem that we're facing in clinical research, which is, inclusion, diversity, and equity. And we're getting a lot of requests about, can your approach help us improve on the current situation where there is so much underrepresentation of minorities in clinical research? And, I wouldn't say that, I think probably, oftentimes ethnicity is not the most checked off box in the EHR, but it's certainly available in a large number of cases. And so you can then start to say, well, okay, yeah, we can look at certain ethnicities, certain races. We can look at targeting particular healthcare organizations, where you will have more socioeconomic diversity. So there are things you can do with real world data that can help you improve on the current sort of dire circumstance of underrepresentation of minorities in clinical trials.
Got it. Great. Thank you. So now that, majority of the audience were in patient recruitment, so now that we've sufficiently worried them, let's put up a let's put up a poll and find out what our audience's organizations are doing for patient recruitment.
All right, fantastic. Let me share the results. So it looks like the #1 patient recruitment strategy today is at 69% analytics and feasibility tools, followed by patient advocacy groups, direct to patient.
Very cool. Very cool. And to think that, not too long ago, it really was, patient recruitment was all about call centers, wasn't it? And there were these, basically all the telephone calls you had to make to recruit, and to think that analytics, the very recognition of it, and that's great. So everything we heard, Peter, this is all about data, isn't it? Where we get it, how do we curate it, how do we harmonize it? Cynthia just glossed over that part. In order for you to be able to do the searches that she was talking about with that kind of precision, a lot of us are misled in the tech world. We say, oh, well, Epic has API, so I can pull data, I can do this. But what they overlook is the fact that this is really tough. It's really hard harmonizing it. So can you share with us some guidelines and best practices for sponsors and CROs? How do we utilize and leverage these diverse data sources, Peter?
I think first of all, the first piece of advice I give is make sure that the data source, any data source you're using, is fit for purpose. And so, you know, with respect to our own EHR data source, I mean, we are bringing in data from multiple EMR systems, and you know, and they are not all the same. And as Cindy pointed out earlier, you know, none of them were made for clinical research. And so, you know, we spend an enormous amount of time basically taking data and making sure that it can be mapped to common data fields, that it is normalized. You may or may not be aware of it, but there are still some EMRs that record weight in ounces. You know, that needs to be transformed into kilograms. There are laboratories that will use different units to report laboratory results. That all needs to be validated and harmonized before it can be useful for the kind of thing that we're doing, either if it's looking for patients or if it's, you know, using EMR data as a data platform for a clinical study. I would say that, you know, one of the biggest things that we come across, and actually I was on a webinar last week that Stat magazine ran, and it was really a fireside chat with Rob Califf, one time head of Duke Clinical Research Institute, one time commissioner of FDA, and you know, one of the world's greatest clinical trialists. And he was really the guy who invented the large, simple trial back in the late 80s, 90s, through which many life-changing treatments or life-saving treatments were tested. And the case report forms for some of those studies were like 4 pages. And I think that what we've got to now is we've kind of gotten to a point of almost, I don't know, it's folks being lazy or just overprotective, but we see that protocols have a lot of inclusion exclusion criteria, some of which are just simply there because they're copied over from a previous protocol, without really strong questioning as to, you know, is that actually necessary? Is this going to help us really define the patient population we want? And then there is an overzealous attitude to actually the collection of data. And I would always say, you know, just because you can get it doesn't really mean to say you should have it. You should think really, really carefully about what questions you're asking, what answers you're trying to get, and then thinking about what's the most appropriate source to get the data that's going to help me answer that question. And so, you know, I think that, you know, we see a lot in the area of wearables. And there have been some great examples of where wearables are being used in I say, a very fit-for-purpose manner. There's that huge study that Johnson & Johnson and Apple are collaborating on in atrial fibrillation, where they're using the EKG capability of the most recent versions of the Apple Watch. That's great. That's it's a fit-for-purpose device for that particular study. Oftentimes we find that there's wearables are really, you know, in mode at the moment. People talk a lot about wearables without thinking, okay, well, you know, is the data we're going to get from wearables what we really want? Is the data we can get from another source? Are we going to bear in mind that, you know, patients may already have a wearable? They may have a normal wristwatch. I mean, remember that there's limited real estate for wearables, unless you want your patient to look like an international watch thief every time they roll their sleeve up. You know, so it's just, you know, thinking around things like that, I think is important. Thinking about how the data actually aligns with study objectives is really important. That will influence your choice of data sources. You know, an example is if you need to know if a medication has been prescribed, you'll find that in the EHR data. If you need to know that that prescription has been filmed and it's been paid for, then you need the claims data as well. So the EHR will only tell you it's been prescribed. It won't actually tell you the patient went to the pharmacy and picked it up when the prescription was filled. You might see it next time round in the EHR because the patient may report, yes, I've been taking ranitidine for the last 30 days for my heartburn. But it won't once it gets entered, the first time it gets entered in the EHR, you don't know it's been filled. So if you're thinking that that's going to be important for your study objectives, then start thinking about, incorporating claims data. If there's going to be, if pharmacoeconomics is important in terms of your study objectives, that's all going to come from claims data. So build in some capacity to have claims data. And then people may think, well, okay, so I've got EHR and I've got claims. Well, I don't really want to use one. So why don't I use claims for everything? So of course, the economic side of what I'm trying to determine is really important. And so I use claims data to try and find patients as well. And you can use claims data to try and find patients, but bear in mind that claims data has a latency on it of around about 3 months. And we've actually had sponsors come to us who've said that they tried using claims data for a study in diabetes, type 2 diabetes. And they see all these patients in the claims who've got an HbA1c greater than 7. And they go, okay, great, let's get them in, let's get them referred to a site. 3 months later, from that data point, patient turns up at the site. Well, their HbA1c is down to below 6, and they're being treated with a drug that and they're no longer eligible for the study. So, our view tends to be that, EHR is way more precise for finding patients than claims is. If you need to have additional information that's not in the EHR, especially around pharmacoeconomics, prescriptions, then bring claims data in as well. And then I kind of finish off really by 2 points. One is that, we still don't know what FDA's final guidance on the use of real-world evidence to support regulatory decision-making is. That's due to be issued in 2021. My personal feeling is that is going to be evolutionary rather than revolutionary. We're obviously, given what we're doing, are very interested to see what that is going to be. And the final comment I would make really on this topic is digital is always best. And make sure you can get a digital source. Even with some tech adapted devices, we have seen that the outputs of those tech devices are PDF files, and that just takes you back to the bad old days of either having to use optical character recognition to digitize that information, or, Lord forbid, have 2 independent data entry people go through it and enter it manually into a database.
Okay.
Yeah, really.
And we saw
an
example of that as recently as last year.
Yes, exactly.
Excellent. Now, you mentioned fit for purpose as a data source, and that's relevant to our next polling question for our audience. So you all be very careful how you answer this, because Peter said you got to be careful what you pick as your data source. So Malcolm, please go ahead with the polling question, please.
Sure. Polling question number 3 asks, are you considering any of these new digital tools? Let me share the results now.
Oh, wow.
Yay.
Bingo.
That's great. That's good. But as Cynthia and Peter said, don't forget about that normalizing and harmonizing. I thought that was a very good point you raised. It's fascinating to me. And one of my personal gripes is, we're in the middle of, our product does interoperability. And this lack of data standards, they're just not converging fast enough, between the healthcare that governs EMR, EHRs, and pharma with CDISC and so forth. There is this chasm, and which is why it's very important to have solutions such as yours that brings these things together. But I really wish if we would begin to pay attention to that. And then you layer on international, Europe and Japan and, Asia, they all have their own standards. And really,
exactly.
Yeah, so that's my soapbox. I'll get off of it for that. Now, Cynthia, you've you wore many hats. We heard you actually worried about the study going through. You were one of the one of the innovators at Face Forward. What advice do you have for sponsors that are considering defining a new digital trial data strategy?
Well, I think one of the key points that we have brought up before, but I want to reiterate, is that when sponsors are planning their protocols and designing their inclusion-exclusion criteria, really think about what's available for the sites to use to determine patient eligibility. You know, what data is available in the EHR? What data is available from test results? What data is available from any MRIs or chest x-rays? You know, think about it from a site's perspective of trying to recruit a patient. Because if you put your inclusion criteria so deep into the weeds where the sites won't have any idea whether a patient meets the criteria, then they're going to have to do pre-screening testing and things like that. And we can't help sites find patients either, because the data just doesn't live in anywhere, in the EHR, in the reports, you know, genetic markers. Do people always do genetic markers? Do you really need to have that test before you get in and start seeing a patient for a trial? You know, so try and find as much as possible that's already available in the clinical data resources. The other thing we try and do is when we get a protocol that's looking for a complicated like quality of life questionnaire or quality of disease questionnaire, we try to figure out what do we have as a surrogate. So when we created the EULAR or the SLEDI criteria, when it said the patient had to have a headache, well, we thought, you know, we would look at not only diagnoses of headaches, but we'd also look maybe in the notes to see if the patient is complaining about headaches. Because oftentimes if it's a symptom, the patients aren't going to have a diagnosis code of a headache, because that doesn't mean it was severe enough to provide a prescription for that headache. So, you know, think about surrogates that are available in the notes. Think about, you know, maybe if you're looking for a severity of cirrhosis, or you can maybe, you know, see if there's something in the notes that talks about how much of the body part is being impacted by the psoriasis, rather. I think we want to also determine where the patients are. So if you're seeing a disease or doing a study for a disease that is normally taken care of in a ambulatory care facility rather than a hospital, then you should try and recruit patients from those facilities. So if you're looking for a patient who has a hyperlipidemia diagnosis and is already on a statin, well, they're probably going to be seeing their doctor in an ambulatory care setting and not a hospital. So plan on trying to recruit from places such as ambulatory settings so that you can get the most bang for your buck. And it may not be a cardiologist, it might be a family practitioner, it might be an internal medicine physician that you want to look at for when you're designing who is going to be included in your trial. How much of it can be done remotely is another question we want to ask. So with COVID coming around March, when we started our proof of concept study looking for diabetic patients in June, which is the trial that Peter talked about before, we had to pivot from a consent form that was done at the site when the patients were being seen to doing a remote e-consent with the patient on the phone with the coordinator at the home. And that worked really well because the patients felt comfortable. The sites didn't have to travel into the office. They didn't have to see patients. So all of that really helped about what do you really need to have the patients come in for, or can you do some of your visits and can you do some of your observations either via a virtual visit through a healthcare organization looking at you on the screen, or can you just have the visiting nurse go out and get your measurements or your lab tests for you? I think that we have to also be careful about using real-world data and the long-term outcomes and following patients in clinical trials regarding privacy issues. So, you know, making sure the consent issue is covered and making sure that patients know that we're going to be using their EHR data, which is part of our consent form, which I think is really important. And then also trying to find a way to expand the ethnicity and the racial disparities and try and close some of those gaps, because we all know that it takes a lot of trust for some of these racial groups to trust their doctors. and we have to make sure that there is not a concern when the patients are being seen by their PCPs, that the PCP may not be the investigator, but they can also help that patient feel comfortable that enrolling in a trial is really important. So also including the primary care providers with the research coordinators and the research groups within these hospital systems or the ambulatory settings is very helpful to help patients feel more comfortable and more at ease with being part of a study.
Yeah, you know, thank you for bringing that up. I think, you know, it took us a while, Cynthia, to begin to refer to patients as patients. Prior to that, they were always subjects. And, you know, you're bringing up a lot of very good points, you know, things, the soft issues aspect of managing patients. And, you know, we didn't talk about this, nor do we have time to, but retention, you know, once you find them, you know, Peter talked about, my God, 65 patients out of, you know, a corpus of millions. You know, retention is really important, and you're absolutely right about that. Maybe we'll have a webinar on that topic all by itself. Thank you very much.
I think one of the, I wanted to say that one of the things on that we feel is really important is, you know, the closer you can make your clinical research part of routine care of the patient, given by the healthcare provider who's typically treating them for that disorder, the better your retention is going to be.
Yeah. No, I agree. There are many factors on that. So what we would like to do is we've got two polls back to back that we would like to pose to our audience. Go ahead, Malcolm, please.
Wonderful. And here are the results.
We are well on our way. That's great.
Yeah, that's excellent.
That's great. That's very impressive. That's great. And the next poll is really addressed at that first tier. We want to see what will you be doing in the future? Which way do you think the trend is going?
Polling question number 5 asks, if we fast forward to 2025, what percentage of your organization's clinical trials will be fully digital?
Hooray!
Well, those 6% gotta get with the program. I mean, clearly that's where the trend is going. Very refreshing, very refreshing. I don't know, what do you think, Peter and Cynthia? Had we done this poll 2 years ago, do you think those adopters would have been that high?
No, I don't think so.
No, I don't think so. No. I think COVID has actually had a good impact on us.
Yes.
You know, that is so true. I think that sometimes good things come from bad. And one of the things that the pandemic has forced us to do is it made a lot of the things that we were doing, we were thinking about doing, it made it all stick. So there is no good about that. We have a number of questions. What I'd like to do is I'd like to, Malcolm, if you could read off the questions. How many questions do we have, Malcolm?
Right now, we're still collecting questions from the audience. Any audience members have any questions, please feel free to submit them in the questions panel in your GoToWebinar portal.
Okay. So we'll take a few minutes and talk about, you know, answer those questions. But a lot of good information. I was thinking that each one of these blocks could, in and by itself, take about a good 45 minutes to discuss. So it was really good. I took away a lot of good nuggets about that.
I think one thing we didn't touch on was the use of virtual cohorts and synthetic control arms. Peter, did you want to just mention that as another use for digital data?
Yeah, I mean, real world data is a great source for putting together synthetic control arms or even virtual cohorts. We've looked at a number, have done some, actually done a retrospective one recently, but you can do these retrospectively, prospectively. I mean, it's pretty straightforward to define the same population in the data, even in the de-identified data, as you're going to have in your treatment group in your study. And then you can just follow those data in parallel with the treatment group in the study. And this is kind of very appropriate in circumstances such as rare disease, where actually enrolling a study with a control group may be ethically questionable, but also may just take you way too long in order to be able to bring that drug to market. Similarly, in some of the rarer cancers, it is just enrollment takes so long if you're having to recruit, 50% of the population who are going to receive standard of care. We can follow standard of care in the data, and thereby reducing the number of patients you need to enroll by half.
So, Sina,
Yes.
a number of questions have come rolling in. Let me share the first one. This attendee asks, I know the primary goal of DRN is to assist with case identification and ongoing data pull for clinical trials, but couldn't it also be useful for retrospective chart reviews, epidemiological studies?
Cindy, do you want to take that?
It could be. And our epidemiology group actually does use the EHR data right now along with claims. So there are some of our trials who want to do a retrospective comparator arm, which is easy for us to do as well. I mean, our focus is to go prospective and find patients and get consent and actually use their data in a more typical trial type of format. But there are parts of some of the studies that we looked at that it did have an epi or health economic portion of them that was going to be important to include as well.
Wonderful. Another attendee asks, of the million of EMR you have access to, how many of them are identifiable patients ready to be recruited?
Good question. So today, within the Digital Research Network contracted sites, there are about 6.6 million patient lives covered, of which about 5.4 million are actionable today. We have a good line of sight on exceeding 10 million by the end of this year, with a plan to be exceeding 25 million by the end of 2021.
Kind of gives me goosebumps. Last year we were at 2 million, so these are all wonderful numbers for us. We've grown very fast this year. It's been excellent. Yeah.
Great. And
I was actually February this year we were at 1.9 million. Yeah.
Wow.
Really?
Yeah.
Wow.
Yes.
Very rapid. That's excellent. And the domain of that is domestic, international. Talk a little bit about that.
This is all US only for the moment. Yeah,
Excellent.
everything is US based. Yeah.
Excellent. Excellent. Wow.
Well, Sina, another attendee asks, what strategies are you using for normalizing and harmonizing data? And are you using natural language processing for unstructured data or notes?
I can take that one. So we have an entire organization which we call clinical informatics, where we have pharmacy specialists, laboratory specialists, medical specialists, who every time we bring on a new organization does a deep dive into the EHR systems that our customers are using and identifies and normalizes and maps the data to our common data model using a few tools we've built called Provenance Manager and Lab Manager and Medication Manager. So we try to keep things to normalize standard code lists such as LOINC codes, CPTs, HCPCS, ICD-10s, etc. But some of the data that we require for things, even just demographics, I mean, we have to know that 1 is male and 0 is female, and M and F and all that kind of stuff has to happen and become a normalized a data set. So even for our customers who are healthcare organizations, when we bring in their data and provide it back to them in one of our one of our products, this is maybe the first time they actually see their entire organization in one user interface, because one of their hospitals might be running on Epic, and one might be running on Cerner, one might be running on Allscripts, and they never get to see each other's data until we bring it in and normalize it, provide it back to them for their own use for healthcare operations. And then that data then becomes de-identified for us to use through statistical de-identification methods, and that becomes the de-identified data source we use for our patient feasibility.
Got it. Well, here's a follow-up question that's asked by another attendee, but in the same vein. What data sets are the most relevant from healthcare data for most trials, in your opinion?
So the data sets would be most likely the EHR data. So the demographics, the medications, the laboratories, the measurements, the procedures, the diagnoses, and also the encounters. So we pull not only all the structured data, but I missed the last question part about the notes. We do use notes, and we also extract notes out using NLP, as well as we have access to the actual physical notes if we need to get into some type of area in the notes that's not extracted yet. So it's quite a broad and deep range of data that we have available to us.
Awesome.
Maybe one more question. We're kind of coming to the hour.
Excellent. Well, here goes a similar question, but I think that you'll have a lot to say about this. How does Optum specifically think about data harmonization as a challenge?
Well, I have to say Optum has been in this business for about 10 years. So we have grown as the electronic health record industry has grown. And historically, back in 2010, when we first began this whole process, we were working with custom-built electronic health record systems. So I think that as the EHR data has become normalized, I think that Optum understands and realizes that in order to be fit for purpose for all kinds of analyses, that it has to be on a common data model, or it just becomes junk in and junk out. So we have literally hundreds of people working around the clock to look at data assets, look at normalization processes, tweak them, make them better. When something new happens, we're right on top of it, such as the COVID lab tests. We were able to put together a brand new data set within a 2-month period that pulled out all the COVID test results. So it's an amazing machine that is well greased and ready to use any kind of data.
Excellent.
But I'm biased, of course.
Well, yeah, I'm virtually getting kicked under the table by our
okay.
Telling me that the time is up. Well, thank you very much. We got 2 minutes. If I could just ask each of you 1 minute closing. Cynthia, you started by saying you had a dream that one day you will see this stuff. I mean, quite a bit of evidence here that we're well on our way. I mean, you saw the positive results from the audience. So do you think you will see that dream of yours? Will you attain it?
Yes, I'm positive we will. Yes, absolutely. Before I retire, it'll be happening.
Okay, very good. Peter, any closing comments?
No, I really appreciate this opportunity to come and talk about what we're doing today. I mean, I hope we have transmitted our enthusiasm for what we're doing. We really, do think this is great stuff. We really enjoy our day-to-day lives, and we'll just, hope that this has been helpful for people who've been listening in.
It has.
Absolutely. Thank you all. Thank you.
It was very enlightening to me too. Thank you very much. Now, some questions we didn't get to, folks. You have our contact information here. Please feel free to reach out. We'd be happy to respond to those, and be on the lookout for our future webinars coming up. And thank you very much. Thank you very much, Cynthia and Peter. Very informative. I learned a lot for sure. Thank you.
Great. Thank you. Thank you very much.
Good day. Bye-bye.
Take care.
Bye-bye.